Hello, and welcome back to Extra Literary Affairs, a podcast for the lit curious reader because why not read a little bit of everything? I'm Jennifer Smith.
And I'm Joey Kelly.
And today we are having another affair with Ling Ma and her short story, Yeti Lovemaking, from her collection, Bliss Montage. This is actually the second story we have read from her collection, and I am so glad that we are revisiting her. And Joey, for the month of April, as you know, we are exploring humor, the rites of spring, a little bit of sexual vitality and energy to offset our previous month of grief throughout the Americas. So each of the selected works this month are humorous in their own way. Still some serious things creep in. I think it'll be really interesting for the two of us to explore what each of us finds humorous and what other people, i.e. the authors of these stories, also choose as humor. So Joey, do you have anything humorous that you'd like to share to kick us off?
Yes, so I do have a joke, but let me preface, these are not my original jokes, and my family is probably making jokes about how I reuse jokes that I find elsewhere. This is from a show called The Vicar of Dibley. It's a British show. It's no longer on the air, but it's hilarious, okay? So here is one of the jokes that Dawn French, who plays the vicar, says, because she ends every episode with a joke. This is one of my favorite jokes in the series, so it's a very short series. So a nun was taking a bath when there was a knock at the door. "Who is it?" she asked. The voice back replies, "It's the blind man. Can I come in?" So the nun thinks for a moment and she says, "Yes, that's fine." The door opens and the man says, "Nice tits. Where do you want your blinds?" Oh my God, hilarious. It's still funny.
I love the joy on so many levels. And I also have a joke for you that I did not write because in my family, I am legendary for blowing the punchline. I just can't get it out. And I thought it was just so funny because it is definitely tied into the story we read today. Why did the Yeti move to New York City? He heard that the dating scene was full of people who were emotionally unavailable. They are impossible to pin down and they leave no trace. He thought, finally, I've found my people. And I really love that because, as we know, Yetis are notorious for their mysterious ways and false sightings. And Joey, I would love to read a short introduction to our story, Yeti Lovemaking, just to center us all in this delightful, super fun, funny, and interesting story from Ling Ma. Yeti Lovemaking follows a woman who is 3 months out of a painful breakup, who meets a man at a wine bar and goes home with him, only to discover he's a Yeti in a business suit, not the New York dating meet cute that she had hoped for. He hands her a pamphlet about Yetis and asks her to consent to a sexual encounter, and the night unfolds as it does. But the story isn't really about the Yeti. It's about the ex this woman can't stop thinking about, whose presence bleeds into every scene. According to her, we hear the author say, the grief she carries has nowhere to go, so it goes everywhere. The mating call she makes that night travels through the city, and several months later, her ex calls her out of the blue. This story ends in a blizzard, and her ex is on the phone with her. His voice is very soft on the other end of the line, and he says, "Don't hang up. Just listen." For me, this was a story about how longing for a person, a relationship, sex can change us, and how strange encounters can sometimes hold up the truest mirrors of our true selves. Joey, what was your impression of the story?
We have both read from Bliss Montage before. Obviously, as you said, we read Los Angeles, but I've read the entire collection. It's one of my favorite short story collections, and I would highly recommend it to everyone. It's pretty rare that I like every story in a short story collection. Usually I'm like, this one's great, this one's kind of a dud, this one I'm kind of neutral on, this one I like, blah, blah, blah. But I really loved every single story in this collection from start to finish. That's a great recommendation. And I really wanted to have us read Yeti Lovemaking because I love how tender and intimate this story is. And it's such an unusual story. It's such an unusual plot to have this woman sort of get catfished, but she doesn't seem to really mind that much. I think she's more intrigued than upset. But I think it's a great example of when a really talented author like Ling Ma can take a fantastical element or a fantasy story. In this case, this is more of what you would call a low fantasy or an urban fantasy, because it takes place in the real world in New York City, but there are fantastical elements. Anyway, to any fantasy purists out there, they can take these fantastical things and use it as a medium to talk about important societal topics that maybe are sort of uncomfortable for some people to think about or talk about. And maybe they don't want to read like a hardcore literary fiction where it's strictly about these topics. It's very much on the page and you have to face those things. So I think that's what I really love about fantasy and sci-fi, is that so often that is what authors are trying to do. I think Octavia Butler is another author who does that fantastically. She uses fantasy as a guise to get you to understand what she's trying to say. But yeah, what a better idea than to have someone wearing a human suit to say, what is it like to walk a mile in someone else's shoes or in their body? What about you, Jennifer? What did you think?
I love this story for all the reasons that you just stated. And for me, it's also, as a Midwesterner, as a person who now lives on the East Coast, any story that takes place about dating in New York is a fantasy story to me, from my perspective. Do people actually live this way? I have no idea. It is so far out of my realm of experience. And what was interesting is that we did read Los Angeles quite some time ago. Loved that story. I have handed it out to friends. It just really resonates with me. Ling Ma has a lot of similarities to the way in which I see the world, so that was really fun to read. And on a weird twist of fate, Joey, there were elements of the story that came up in a conversation I had with my partner because we are watching a new show, which is called DTF St. Louis. And that has been a
That
lot.
does not sound like your type of show, but okay. It took me a second to be like, what in the heck?
We are kicking off April with a bang, and we are very excited to get some humor and some deeper topics. So back to the story, as you said, serious topics come in here: isolation, belonging, what type of outer suit and persona do you put into the world? She's comparing the Yeti to her old boyfriend. It's like, well, this nice looking man in a business suit walks up and buys me a glass of wine and treats me well and asks me to go back to his house. Okay, why not? What's the worst that can happen? And her friend's like, are you sure that's a good idea? And she's like, yeah, normal people, non-psychos, non-serial killer types, they also have one-night stands. So it's not a big deal. But it goes so much deeper because throughout the storyline, it's woven in that she keeps thinking about her ex. And at some point, she says, oh, I'm not grieving for my ex. I am so over that. I'm like, really, unreliable narrator? You seem like you might be a teeny tiny bit connected to that story. And that was my reading of it, Joey. But your reading may be completely different. That if you tell me you're over it, I have to say you're over it.
I honestly didn't even pay attention to anything about her ex. Maybe I was just so caught up in this Yeti part, even though I've read it a few times now, that for some reason it just went over my head, I guess. That was not something that I felt like was as important to the story for me. Obviously, it's still important to the story. Just subjectively, it was not something that was drawing my interest quite as much.
So, Joey, there are so many serious topics in here, but the idea of the Yeti mating call, like making these very strange sounds, even though it's fantastical and we're like, I don't think Yetis are real, this story was real. And this symbolism of wanting to connect, it doesn't matter if you're a human or a Yeti, you still want to connect, to be understood, to have your physical limitations and preferences honored. It was just very touching to me, Joey. Do you want to talk a little bit about the consent piece?
Yes, this is one of the other reasons I really love the story, is for the consent, because I think that's really the most tender part for me. There is a lot of communication that has to happen prior to them engaging in sexual activity with one another. And as you said in the beginning with the summary, he gives her a pamphlet that's like Yeti Lovemaking, obviously that's where the title comes from, but it's basically how to have sex with a Yeti 101. And it's about their history and their physical anatomy functionally, how does this work between a human and a Yeti? You're not the same species, but you're sentient and you can give consent. So this is not bestiality, I would say. It was for me more of a metaphor of having a consensual adult sexual partner that has some sort of limitation. And that could be like maybe they're missing a limb of some kind. It could be an arm, a leg, whatever, it doesn't matter. So maybe sex has to work physically different because you have to account for that person's limitation. And that's okay. Or it could be someone that has HIV or something like that. It could be any type of limitation or something that is atypical that you might expect with a sexual partner. But it requires that type of conversation to be had to make sure that the other person is aware of that this is a limitation that will come up if you're going to engage in sex as an adult. This is how you overcome that, or if you stay mindful of that limitation, and is this person still okay with that idea? They are free to choose to do whatever they want. And so I'll read a quote from the text because I think this is a good example of healthy consent. I think so many times in stories, we get stories that are just non-consensual because they're more dramatic and it's traumatic, okay? But let's normalize having good stories about consensual sex. I mean, come on. In the story, it says, "Do you want to pet my fur?" he asked, almost shyly. His camel-colored fur, drying by street light, looked luxurious. He crossed the room slowly and knelt in front of me. I touched both shoulders, as if knighting him. It was soft. I hadn't thought it would be this soft. It was like petting a Maine Coon times 10. And when I heard the growl emanate from him, I wasn't scared because it was a growl of pleasure. It was a purr uttered by someone who wasn't used to purring, so it came out harsh and strangled. The city was not his natural habitat. Only later would I understand that a Yeti asking you to pet his fur was the ultimate privilege, that we are already bonding. When I drew my hand back, there was blood on my fingertips. His skin was surprisingly scratchy. I didn't know this was going to happen, I said. It's in the pamphlet, he said. The last page of the pamphlet, titled Yeti Lovemaking, explained the differences between the human body and the Yeti body. Differences so significant that strict compromises had to be brokered before this unnatural act could proceed. The Yeti epidermis was lined with tiny incisors and had been this way for millennia. So just to wrap up my thought here, it would be helpful if someone gave you a pamphlet and said, here's my limitations, here's how we're going to do it. But she didn't take enough time to learn and internalize, like, oh, okay, I cannot pet this Yeti because he has sharp skin. And then again, it's just a conversation. It's not like, oh, I messed up, I'm so sorry or whatever. It's just like, hey, this was my boundary. You crossed it. Let's pull it back in.
Joey, I saw that a little bit differently. I didn't feel it was a boundary. It was more that he gently reminded her that was in the pamphlet. And it was clear to him in that moment, she hadn't, as you said, hadn't read through all the details. She kind of skimmed it. And if you are embarking on something as important as a sexual relationship with someone that you do not understand, it might take a minute. You might want to read the pamphlet. Joey, I cracked up because there were so many funny things in here. My father, since the time I was a very small child, loved Old Spice. And so for me, Old Spice equals dad energy equals old man equals ick. Okay, so that is my universal starting point. So in this story, she says, oh, he's in the bathroom and this waft of Old Spice comes out. But I was like, ew, yuck. How are you going to get past that? I realize that is not everyone's experience. And no offense, Old Spice, I'm so happy that you still exist. But there is a lot of nostalgia for me. And the fact that Ling Ma puts that in there, there's a lot of these cultural markers. She had hoped that the handsome stranger put something in her drink to be more of an aphrodisiac and not an incapacitation. She's like, no, it was just a straight up Manhattan, normal drink. Oh, well, let's see what else happens. And so there was this playfulness of being a very savvy person, of being a little bit playful, of being hopeful, of saying, hey, I am so over my ex. That was like 3 months ago. I am definitely moving on in this story. And yet that ex, as in many of Ling Ma's stories, all two that I have read, so I will say on both of the stories that I have read of hers, there is this lingering idea that your exes hold some sort of space. Joey, you sometimes say, don't let those people live rent-free in your head. I've heard you say things like that.
Yeah.
I think her ex is doing that. I thought it was so beautiful the way that Ling Ma explains Yeti lovemaking with a human. And you don't call it making love because it's not the same. I could tell you the name of it, but there is no known phonetic transcription. The name of it is a mating call. First the Yeti calls, and then you call, and that's the name. That's how the act is initiated. It takes two parties to make the sound of the name of the thing you're going to do, which is different every time, which grows stranger and more lonely every time. I didn't expect the loneliness in here. I get that they are learning each other. I think for people who have been in a sexual situation, learning a person, having them learn you, it's a process. Generally, that leads to closeness and understanding. And I love the way that she says, what we're doing, it's like sign language. There's not a word for it. It's just something that gets created brand new every single time in combination with these people. So like for me, that was super beautiful. But then it's just like, but yeah, it's just lonely and then gets lonelier and it gets lonelier. I was really hoping for a different trajectory for you.
Yeah.
That was also a little surprising. So I know in March, we spent the whole month talking about grief. And I'm like, oh, yay, we're in April, April Fools. This is going to be great. We are going to have this really fun and flirty time. And we have a fun and flirty time with the story. And yet, grief, trauma, longing, all of it's still in there. I'm like, come on, are we really going to have a fun story someday? We will, I promise. We'll focus on that.
I think this is a fun story, but there are some heavier topics in here. But to go back to the lonely part, maybe Ling Ma put that in there because we only know that only one pamphlet exists, at least. We're not shown any of the other ones, if they do exist. But maybe that's as far as this relationship between this Yeti and this woman could go, is just having sex. It can only be a physical relationship and not an emotional one or a romantic one. We can guess that she has sex with him quite a few times in the beginning.
She says 30.
Yeah, so they're having sex a lot. Okay, that's fine. But maybe each time the Yeti understands, like, okay, we're literally different species. Maybe it's not physically possible for them to reproduce. Now we have to think about the genetics of this. Because obviously they're compatible anatomically. We can assume because that's how they're having sex. Probably, I don't know, because we don't get all the details.
I'm going to challenge you on that. Because I feel that there is sexual intimacy. I believe that they were also acting safely to avoid the complications of not practicing safe sexual encounters in all the ways that you can do that. There probably is the question of breeding because they mentioned there's around 19,000 Yetis in the world. And apparently the number's not going down. And again, Joey, this was also what was very funny. They're having this disclosure between each other. And it's like, yeah, I think I should just mention I'm a Yeti, but I am also 174 years old. Just like, cool.
Wow, learn a
Like those
lot.
really bizarro things. And when you talk about fantasy stories, those usually aren't for me, right? I just typically shy away from that. But in this story, it completely worked. Of course, a Yeti can be 174 years old and still hanging out singles bars, buying ladies glasses of wine. Why wouldn't he? Where else are you going to meet? At the library? I don't think so.
Maybe Yetis are studious and they love to read. I think they're probably coming out in all varieties, and they are coming a very long way from the Himalayas all the way in New York City. But I don't know that they're able to crossbreed. Maybe they're able to breed with other Yetis. Maybe they're able to produce children with human beings, and that's how their
Wouldn't
numbers
want
are going.
to because their relationship does not support that, Joey. So I'm back on board with your they meet. They're like, this could be fun. They tried it. The ending is, for me, it's a little open-ended. Do they continue? Do they not? I would just like to read that opening passage, Joey, because I was like, this is definitely the story for us. Yeti lovemaking starts out. Making love with a Yeti is difficult and painful at first, but it's easy once you've done it more than 30 times. Then it's like riding a bike. The human body learns, it adapts. The skin toughens, capillaries become less prone to breakage, contusions heal by morning. You don't even see them. Certain fluids stop secreting altogether. And for me, that was an interesting and compelling way to start the story because I'm like, pardon me, what is the story about? Then it immediately goes to, and we don't call this making love. Do tell. What are you calling it then? And for me, growing up in a certain time frame and of a certain generation, I think there is a lot of social structure around who is approved to be in relationships. What are relationships for? Do you do casual? Is that a thing? I think just people from the Midwest, blanket statement, people my age, I think may have some pretty clear ideas of what is correct by society's standards. And I love that Ling Ma throws that all right out the window. And she's like, hey, if you've got a problem with one night stands, not my problem. If you have a problem with me trusting a interesting looking person and going home with him, again, not her problem. She's making that someone else's problem. If you don't like it, don't do it. But I get to do, as the main character in this story, whatever floats my boat, as we would say in the Midwest, go for it. And I just really appreciated that. But it also made me sad, Joey. So, of course, I can't have a single story that doesn't make me sad. That poor Yeti, he is used to dealing with people who just don't get him. So he was like, yeah, I just have this little pamphlet. And if it was me, I'd be like, a pamphlet. And like, there's just a little signature part on the back. If you could just authorize that you read through the pamphlet, I'll just sign and date that with you, right? Just a very interesting premise and very fun.
Yeah. I don't see this as a one-night stand, though, because they have sex so many times. So they're more like a situationship.
But it started with a one-night stand, according to her. So I guess it has to start somewhere.
Yeah, it does seem like this is just a one and done kind of thing, or that's the intention at first, and then they just figure out like, oh, I like what you're doing, you like what I'm doing, so let's keep doing it. But that's a good point, I think, to bring up your perspective from the Midwest and being from a specific era, because I think certainly with my generation and being from the East Coast, specifically New Jersey, it's, I think, just a lot more open in terms of what are the possibilities for a relationship and what is okay to have as your goals in life. Because I think in previous generations, and still in mine, okay, I'm not going to say it's not, I think it's really refreshing to read stories like this when the narrative is not, you have to get married and have children and buy a house, whatever order, okay? Usually it's like get married, get a house, and then have kids. There's so many other opportunities and so many different trajectories that your life can have, and I really like that Ling Ma is discussing that in this story, that it might not be what the societal norm once was, but that's okay because time evolves, standards evolve in society, and so that's okay for us to engage with that. And it's okay to have a lifestyle that people would think was alternative, which is a nice way of saying, like, don't do that. That makes you fucking weird. Back in the day, I'm a 90s baby, okay? That was very much a thing in the 90s as well. I'm not going to say it wasn't. But yeah, I really like that we get a different perspective, that there is another way to live outside of that very structured societal norm.
Sorry, I just want to read one more passage because this is so lovely. And it's a very, very short story. So if the listeners have not purchased Ling Ma's collection, Bliss Montage, as you said, every story in it is great. And that's so rare for us to agree on those types of things. Again, I've only read 2 stories, but I'm 100% behind that she normalizes, as you said, what's going on. And this I loved. So she's explaining to us as the readers, that's by saying, you probably have heard the call so many times walking through the parking garage of your office building in this palatial lakeside city where women are always in Congress with mythical creatures, unbeknownst to you, right under your nose. Maybe you thought it was a foghorn, even though it was a clear night. Maybe you thought it was a wounded coyote wandering again downtown, or someone grieving the same way every night, boring almost in her distress. But I was not grieving. I met the Yeti 3 months after we broke up. And Joey, that's why I love the fantastical. It's like, you don't even know the magic things that are happening in this city. Let me clue you in that there are things that you cannot even begin to imagine. So that was really fun. But also the unreliable narrator part of this, where she was like, it sounds like grieving. And it was kind of boring. But I'm neither boring nor grieving. But just coincidentally, it was 3 months after we broke up that I met the Yeti. Why are you mentioning this to me? It's just an interesting thing. It's like, I'm so over you. I don't even remember when we broke up. 3 months, 2 days, and 8 hours ago.
Yeah.
For example, it was just such an interesting juxtaposition, as you say, the fantasy element of women are finding these mythical creatures in all corners of the city. And you guys, if for the uninitiated, you don't even know what you don't know. And I really like that playfulness.
Yeah, I think this is oddly enough very realistic, despite the Yeti part. because I think it's pretty common for, I don't know about every generation, but at least my generation, to have this sort of rebound person after a breakup where you're like, I still look hot. I still got it. I still have stuff to offer this world. Okay. And so you go out to prove it to yourself, or maybe to get back at whoever you were dating, to be like, haha, told you I'm still good. I think there's so many just wonderful things that she gets to blend into this story. And like you said, it's so short that it's really just a testament to how great of a writer that Ling Ma is. And I highly suggest everyone also read Severance, because it's also very good. Yeah, there's so many beautiful things in this story.
And they do reference him coming down from the highlands in the Himalayas, which is the lore of where Yetis come from. And they end the story with her sitting in a blizzard. Her boyfriend's on the phone and she's literally trying to communicate. She can't get her words out. And he's like, that's okay. Just listen. And so it was just this weird juxtaposition of now when she wants to connect, she literally doesn't have words. The way Ling Ma wrote it was also kind of interesting, like this scratching, sort of clanging together kind of noise. And her ex-partner doesn't hang up the phone. And he was like, that's okay. Just listen. And for me, it was the every person, your ex, you, your Yeti partner, everyone that I've encountered wants their story to be heard. They want someone to get them. They want somebody to listen and say, you had a dream? Tell me more. And I had to laugh, Joey, because nobody wants to hear your dreams. It's true. Nobody wants to hear them. I think they do. They do not. But in the story, her ex calls and says, I have a dream that I want to tell you about. You're there. All my other girls are in there. He goes through this whole long story. And I was like, why are you calling me again, ex? It was a little curious. And then the end where he was like, just listen. You don't have to talk. Just listen. I was like, he's lonesome and he wants somebody to share his thoughts with. And she's a safe space because they were together. We don't know what happens at the end of the story. That's like ... What happens? Does she say like, lose my number because you broke up with me, or I broke up with you for a reason? Like, we don't know any of that extra story, but I really did appreciate that, Joey. And I'd love to transition to a topic that you brought up, the immigration angle, the climate change, the Himalayas. What else is layered in this story that is fantastical, but also rooted in places?
Yeah, I think that is one of the other elements that I found to be really interesting about this story is, other than sex and the grieving of a past relationship and that person that you probably were in that relationship, we have obviously the Yeti, okay, who has to wear a human skin suit. So he's not able to go outside of his apartment, or any other Yeti, we can assume, without wearing this suit. And there's actually a detective story trilogy about a dinosaur. They're all like really funny satirical titles. But anyway, it's a dinosaur detective who has to wear a human suit. All the dinosaurs do. And it's really just very funny. That's what it's making me think of in this moment. So apparently I have read other stories like that. But it was so sort of tragic. When I think of a Yeti, I think of like huge, maybe 7 feet tall, if not bigger. And they have to physically scrunch themselves into this human suit because they need to look like a human. So traditionally, Yetis would be, like I said, very tall and very broad with huge shoulders, huge hands, huge feet.
Hairy fur, big fur that comes down.
That's talked about in the story, is that this human suit is very hot, especially, I'm sure, in the summer. In the winter, maybe it's a little bit easier, but I'm sure they overheat pretty quickly because they have a lot of hair. So having to get your body to conform, not only do you have to assimilate to a different culture that's not your own, and you have no choice, and that's language and names and all that other stuff, but you have to literally conform physically to a different appearance. And it's not just clothing, it's your physical stature. You are literally shrunk to take up less space than you would normally, or naturally in this case.
It is like shrinking yourself to fit someone else's beauty standard. It's like a middle-aged woman cramming into her Spanx to try to put everything together. They're like, no, I am so that other thing. And the unraveling of that, it's like, I'll be right back. And he takes the suit off and she's like, you tricked me, but let's talk about it. Because she could have bolted out of that apartment. Yeah, I didn't sign up for that. And when we think about cultural beauty standards, it's like there's a certain way to look. And in the case of the Yeti, as you eloquently put, he physically has to shrink his body down. He's confined by these expectations. He can't reveal his true nature until he gets home and literally drops the mask, becomes his full self. And she's like, okay, I guess I can work with this. Tell me more.
Yeah, and I want to read the excerpt from the story about the history of the Yeti, which sounds like it's going to be long. It's not. Okay, so it says the Yeti came from the Himalayas. In the face of human overpopulation, entire clans had migrated to the farthest reaches of nature, to its highest, least hospitable altitudes. Only since the 1970s had they descended and learned to assimilate into human society. While there had been reported incidents of humans being eaten, those cases were considered anomalies as the Yeti diet was primarily plant-based. The Yeti population stood at an estimated 19,300. If I was reading this now, I was lucky enough to behold this mythological creature whose lineage stretched further back than my own. Fate had found me. The plural of Yeti is Yetis. I like that she ends it with that to remind us that it's a community, it's a population, it's an entire culture of Yetis. They're not a monolith.
Well, Joey, I also love that you called attention to that because for me, human and humans also ends in an S. So for me, Ling Ma was like, a Yeti is a human is a Yeti. It could be equivalent, like you are a single person representing yourself, but in collective, when we all get together, you're the whole civilization. So I just thought that was really quite interesting. And I love that she said starting in the 1970s is when the Yeti had to move out into the world, right? They needed to expand. As a child of the 70s, we knew about Bigfoot, we knew about Yeti, we knew about UFO sightings. Those things were very much in the public consciousness. They were on the news, they were on the playground, they were everywhere. And I was like, oh, isn't that interesting that that's my connection to this story, that of course we are always on the lookout for Yetis somewhere.
Yeah, you never know.
You never
Look
know.
to your left, look to your right. One of you's a Yeti. I really love that we get this example of something that humans have done throughout history, which is that they push other indigenous populations out of their ancestral homelands to make way for themselves. I'm sorry, the colonizer in this case. Not all humans are colonizers. And so the Yetis are said to go up into the Himalayas to escape the human interaction or intervention because they are being literally pushed out. And so we don't know how long they're up there, I guess. We know when they come down, but we don't know how long they've been up there. And maybe they've evolved at this point. Maybe it was like really early on in history or prehistory. And so they've evolved. Now I'm going like way too deep into the lore of this Yeti in the story. But anyway, and that they come back down because it seems like, again, overpopulation. Humans are saying, no, you can't stay up in the Himalayas. We have all these rich people that will climb Mount Everest and die up here. So you need to go. Okay. And that's happening today. But I just think it's so tragic that they lose so much of themselves. And again, this is such a classic thing that happens to indigenous populations, that they are forced to assimilate into all of these different societies against their will. They don't want to do these things. And I think that's a lot of where the isolation is coming from this Yeti, is because if there's only 19,300 Yetis in the entire world, we could pretty much assume that if they made it from Asia to the United States, North America, they're probably pretty far spread at this point. So it's probably really hard for them to find other Yetis. And then how do you identify yourself as a Yeti? They don't tell us that in the story. Maybe there's a code, or maybe there's like a look about them, their gait or their mannerisms or their speech or something like that. But yeah, just a tragic story. Humans doing stupid stuff as per usual.
As per usual, if you are forced to assimilate to a dominant culture because you are no longer physically able to live where you want, how do you recognize people who come from your background? You're not supposed to let people know you're a Yeti, right? You're not supposed to let people know. I'm trying really hard to mask that. So that is a very good question about identity and belonging, which is something we talk about a lot on this channel. And I'm just going to say one more thing about Yetis and environment and why they come down from the Himalayas and these very cold, exotic places to most of our imaginations. As you know, I've been reading Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818, and the monster in Frankenstein flees. He's like I can't be part of society. I have proven that this is not going to work out for me. So I am going to go north. He was going towards the North Pole. He was fleeing to isolated places so he could find some peace. And I just thought that was just such an interesting thing that 1818 was a very long time ago, more than 200 years ago. And those ideas of go north, go high, go to glaciers, get out of town. If you want to find some peace, that's the only place you are going to find it. And like our Yeti, even though he was fleeing from his location, the scourge of judgment of people looking at him, of him being othered, it still exists no matter where he lands. So, Yeti, I'm loving it. I'm glad there's a pamphlet. There's probably a Yeti support organization somewhere.
Oh, I hope so.
I'm really digging it.
I just want to bring up that because you said that he's being othered just like the creature in Frankenstein, because that's true, obviously, but there's only one creature. Well, there should have been two, I guess, but Victor chickens out.
He totally did.
Yeah, just make it. Okay, anyway. But then there's a whole consent issue. I mean, there's a whole lot of issues. We will talk about that in Summerween, okay? So stay tuned for those thoughts. But in that excerpt that I had read, it said that the Yeti had been accused of eating human beings, but these were anomalies because they're plant-based. They're herbivores, so they would not naturally eat human beings, and these were just one-off cases. But I think that is also a good metaphor for different communities. We could see this in the United States currently, unfortunately, that communities are treated as monoliths. So if one person from any community makes a mistake or does something intentionally criminal or whatever, that now represents the entirety of that community. In case someone didn't know what a monolith meant. I just like how real that is in reality. That's how it works with when you're a community of indigenous people or immigrants of any kind are othered, because if one of you makes a mistake, it does not matter that the rest of you do not, that does not apply to you. You are not the same person. And so I think Ling Ma is making that a very easily understood concept, and maybe someone who would not think like that naturally, maybe someone that does think that a single person can be a monolith for a community, were to read this and be like, oh my goodness, I see the error in my ways. Now that is a pipe dream, because I doubt they're going to do that, because they're probably not reading anyway, and they probably don't know how to read. They're probably illiterate. Actually, all tea and all shade. But yeah, I just really like that. Again, she's using fantastical elements to bring up something that's a very serious, realistic issue that's currently going on.
And speaking of issues that are currently going on, Joey, I love that she said it was a plant-based diet. So also advocating for vegetarianism, veganism. They talk about climate change. They talk about overpopulation. They talk about having to flee because he's a climate refugee. He can't be where he wants to be. I thought that was also very timely. I hate that this exists, but I love that you brought it up, that when we are dealing with communities, one person who steps outside of the social norm, either unintentionally or because they have a personality disorder or some other violent tendency, the whole group gets castigated as bad. And I was just thinking, it's like, hey, Joey, we have this thing with heterosexual men, people that are in my dating pool. They're psycho killers. They're murderers. We don't stop dating men in general because 1% of the population is certifiably insane or problematic or violent or whatever that is. And it's just an interesting reminder that we talk about this a lot, that it's an case by case individual basis, and these broad stereotypes about who is good, who is bad, who is safe, who is unsafe is completely off base. You shouldn't make generalizations because how unfair. It just seems really unfair. So, Joy, I don't know where I'm going with that point, but I do love that you brought that idea to me. One person does something wrong and the whole group gets a negative stereotype placed against it. And I know we're going to talk about this soon, Joey, the manosphere. So I guess there is some precedent in our current environment that maybe some people are thinking that men aren't all that all the time. And there will be some repercussions about that. But just a curious little nod to Ling Ma asking us, Do you go case by case? Are you making broad assumptions about people? And where are these women living in big cities having these mythical relationships with pretty cool creatures? I'm kind of into that for them.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's really great. Okay, you just have to be careful with their skin because it's full of incisors. But apparently, they're really great at sex. So don't
So there you
underestimate the
go.
game.
Thank you so much for that insight, Joey. This was a really fun story.
Okay, so thank you so much for watching or listening. And if you liked today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe, and follow us on TikTok, okay, at Extra Literary Affairs. And next week, we will continue our journey of humor with a short story called White Wedding by Malachi McIntosh.
Awesome. Looking forward to it, Joey. See you then.
Bye.
Bye.